Okay, so here we are. We're going to talk about anatomical planes of our domestic animals. And there's the spelling of anatomical planes. And planes are two-dimensional structures that really cut animals into segments. They're infinitely thin. Think of a knife cutting an animal into some sections. So let's do the medial plane. I'm up here in the upper right hand corner. The medial plane is this section that does divide an animal into, let's say, a perfect left half. This is the left side of the animal, and on the other side it's the right side. Okay, and so we could also call that a medial plane and also Mid Sagittal Plane. So hopefully you see where I'm at up here in the top. Mid Sagittal means cutting it into a perfect left and right half. Now, if you're talking about sagittal planes, that's another term I have here. It is a plane that sections an animal into an imperfect left portion and a right portion. That's sagittal. If it's a perfect left and right half, it's mid-sagittal, also called medial plane, also called median plane. Now we have two other planes. Let's look at the dorsal plane. It's a horizontal plane as the quadruped is standing, and let's say it's standing in a lake or a river. So the surface of the water is really the dorsal plane, and then it's also called the frontal plane. I don't know a lot of the history of this, but those two things are meaning the same thing, a dorsal plane versus a frontal plane. The surface of water when a dog, in this case, walks into a lake. Then we have a transverse plane. That's this thing, up and down, up and down. There's transverse, perpendicular to the long axis of the body. So there's a perfect transverse section. It's going to give you some cranial portion and some caudal portion. And of course, the plane could be here, it could be back here. When you're usually in the neck region and do a transverse section, you tend to be perpendicular to the long axis of the neck. Likewise, the tail. You try to be perpendicular to the long axis. So those are the three main planes. Medial plane, also called mid-sagittal. Then you have dorsal or frontal, and then transverse. And then a fourth plane I'm bringing over here called the oblique. This would be a plane that is not a perfect 90 degrees to these planes. So let me show you what I've got here. And I guess I'll show you this thing here, down here, get rid of this, and bring it over this. There's an oblique section of a person, and it's in this purple. Okay, so it's not going to be the typical other three planes. And then I've got another example in this tubular structure that this plane that's in the kind of the weak yellow color is cutting this tubular structure in an oblique plane. Very interesting. Okay, so we're going to show you different views of those anatomical planes. So here we have a dog, transverse planes, And they're indicating that if it's the long axis of the abdomen, you would cut it like this. In the neck region, you would tend to be perpendicular to the long axis. Dorsal planes are also called frontal planes. They are the surface of the water. And the third main plane is called, I'm down here in the lower part, median plane, sorry. And that's going to be into a left or right half. If it's median, it's perfect left or right half. If it's off, it's called a sagittal plane, some kind of left and right portions. Now here's a cow. Let's do those three planes again. And there's the surface of water, which is called the dorsal plane or the frontal plane. Then we have transverse planes, perpendicular to the long axis of the animal. And then we have a plane that, let's say, divides an animal into some left or right portions. Here it's called sagittal plane. If it's perfect in the left-right half, it's called the medial plane or mid sagittal plane. Now here we have a picture of Blossom. I think it's a female, the tallest cow in the world, at least at one point. She's very big. This happens to a lot of Holsteins, by the way. They tend to be the largest animals. And so I'm going to show you transverse plane. So I'm going to go through these planes. Transverse, frontal or dorsal. And then I can't really show you on the body the mid-sagittal plane, but on the head I can. So there's the mid-sagittal or medial plane. And this woman is very proud of her cow, which I think is wonderful. Now in this series, I want to show you, here's Blossom again. And of course, these anatomical planes are what we said, and I guess I'll show you again. Dorsal, frontal, transverse, and then if we did the left and right half, it'd be sagittal or mid-sagittal or medial plane. Okay, but I want to show you that then if an animal is in a different orientation, the planes don't change. So in this case, this would be transverse. Okay, transverse, long, perpendicular to the long axis of the animal. This would still be the frontal plane, and then it's hard to show you the mid-sagittal plane, right? But whenever the animal is in a different orientation, it doesn't matter. All the terms are the same. Frontal plane, transverse. This is the ventral surface of the animal. This is the dorsal surface of the animal. Okay? Cranial, caudal. Terms that we're going to be coming up to next. So we're going to just orientate ourselves. Look at this cat. That demarcation between the grayish color and the black, that's the mid-sagittal plane, the medial plane, the median plane. Very neat. Then animals that are in water can show us the frontal plane or the dorsal plane, right? Cutting all these animals this way. If they were up higher, if the water was up higher, it would be like that. Okay. Then we can also have a kangaroo that somebody has drawn. Thank you. And they're really showing us that these anatomical planes are the same. Dorsal or the frontal, transverse, making some kind of cranial portion and some kind of caudal portion. And this plane here, which is called the sagittal plane, and if it's in the perfect left and right half, it would be called the mid sagittal plane. Okay, just showing you more anatomy, different things. And for birds, I found this, and I was happy because it's hard to find for birds. But they have a frontal plane, which is going to divide an animal into an upper portion and a lower portion. It's got a sagittal plane, and if it's perfect left and right half, it would be a mid sagittal plane. And then they've got transverse plane mentioned, and that's going to be perpendicular to the long axis of the bird and divide it into some front portion and some rear portion. Front might be called cranial portion, and the rear portion might be called the caudal portion. So those terms do apply to birds in that picture. And then of course I found this. Well, gosh, fish can be divided into transverse sections, sagittal section, that means some kind of left and right portion, and if it was perfect, it'd be mid sagittal or medial or median. And then a frontal plane, also called the dorsal plane, would divide the fish into some upper portion and some lower portion. So that was good. So now I want you to watch this little video I made with this salad cucumber.
Okay, we're doing a little lesson in using our anatomical planes and terms of direction or directional planes. I have a salad cucumber here I'm going to be cutting up. It's easy to do to demonstrate, and later on you'll see I'll be using some meat products, and all along the way I'll be chomping this stuff down because I'm hungry. Anyway, the thumbtacks are eyes, there's the nose, and I even cut in a mouth. So if this animal is like this, and look at the little vine tail I have, this is cranial, this is caudal. So wherever I am on the animal, if I'm here, I can move in a cranial direction, or even if I'm up here, I move in a caudal direction. Then I can move lateral. Now lateral means to the side, so I could go to the animal's left lateral side, that's over here, or right lateral side. Medial is towards the middle. And the neat thing about these anatomical planes that we'll be talking about, right, we've had these listed and shown you static pictures. The transverse plane goes perpendicular to the long axis of the animal. Okay? And then the medial plane, or also the mid-sagittal plane, would go right down the middle of the animal and create a left and a right half. If you had a plane parallel to that divided an animal into unequal halves, those are the sagittal planes. So there's an infinite number of sagittal planes. If it's right down the middle, you could say it's the medial plane or the mid-sagittal plane. And then two other planes, of course. One is called the frontal plane, and it's also called the dorsal plane. So let me turn this around. And if the animal walked into water, the horizontal surface of the water would be called the dorsal plane or the frontal plane. Then, let's say we cut an animal this way. Hopefully you can see that's not a perfect transverse. Then that would be called an oblique plane. Oblique is off from the perfect transverse, off from the perfect medial plane or sagittal plane. It's just a term that catches all of those other possible planes. So now I'm going to cut this animal here in a transverse plane. Okay, So it's not equal 50-50, but there it is. So now if you look at this end, I have what's called a cross section of the animal. I did a transverse and it yields a cross section. Then if I cut this animal down the medial plane, which I'm trying to make sure I'm in the viewfinder here. So that's a mid sagittal or medial plane. Then lo and behold, that gives me a longitudinal section of the animal. Now if I took that longitudinal section and did something weird like this, I could say I cut the animal in an oblique plane. Okay, I just got done demonstrating the salad cucumber and I ate about half of it. Now I've got some hard salami that's been wrapped around mozzarella cheese stick. And I just want to go through this again, although I don't have the eyes on here, but let's just say this is cranial, this is caudal. So any place along the way, if I move forward, I could say I'm moving in a cranial direction. Even up here I can go in a caudal direction. Lateral, of course, could be either side. If this is the head, then this is the left side of the animal, and the left side never changes no matter how the animal is orientated. And also, if this is the backbone of the animal, that's dorsal. Well, even if the animal is sideways, it's still dorsal. Upside down, dorsal. You could put the animal in dorsal recumbency, let's put it that way. Now I'm going to do a transverse section of this quote-unquote animal. I'm glad it's edible here and whatever. So I'm doing a perfect transverse. Need a sharper knife, and I'm going to, yes, eat it. Now, if I cut it down straight down the middle and made an equal left and right half, then that would be the medial plane, also called the Mid Sagittal Plane. There's only one of those. Obviously, let's go back to the transverse. There's an infinite number of transverse. There's one medial plane. But then if I go off and make an unequal left and right half, that's called a sagittal plane. And then if the animal walks into water, and it's always hard to demonstrate that on these kind of things, that's the frontal plane, but it's also called the dorsal plane. And that plane divides an animal into some upper portion and a lower portion. Never perfect. You can't divide an animal upper and lower perfectly. So there's an infinite number of frontal or dorsal planes. And then of course, just to review then, if you have a oblique plane, you don't get a perfect cross section. You get an oblong kind of cross section. The diameter, the shortest diameter, is still present, so I'm going to chew this real fast. I'm hungry. Anyway, very good. So there's many tubular structures in the animal. So now I'm going to not do a whole animal. I'm going to look at a part of an animal. Intestines, oviduct, seminiferous tubules, ureters, all kinds of tubular structures inside the animal. So if you have a tubular structure, let's say this is part of the seminiferous tubule, and you do a perfect cross section, it's getting a little soft, you could measure the diameter of the seminiferous tubule, and that could tell you something about the animal. Just a little highlight, seminiferous tubules increase in diameter as the animal approaches puberty and then develops towards full sexual maturity. Okay, you could actually measure it and compare it to other animals that are in like different diets, different genetics. And so remember, you do a perfect transverse section, and that's a cross section. Now sometimes the seminiferous tubules might be cut in a longitudinal fashion, more like a sagittal plane. Well, then it's hard to do a diameter, but lo and behold, this point to this point is still the diameter of a tubule. So yeah, I'm trying to see if I'm doing that right. Yeah. So this applies to tubular structures in the animals as well. So there's a longitudinal section of, let's say, a seminiferous tubule, and you could see sperm production there if indeed that was a seminiferous tubule. Thank you.
Okay, so I've done the planes for a quadruped. I do want to show you for humans, and you can pause this, of course. The median plane divides a human, who's not a quadruped, of course, into a left and right portion. If it's perfect, it's medial. Median plane, medial plane. It could be a sagittal plane if it's not perfect. Then transverse of a human does this way, perpendicular to the long axis. But here's the new player, the coronal plane. It actually divides, and there's many planes like this, into some anterior part of the body and some posterior part of the body. That's the coronal plane, which we do not talk about in our domestic animals. So you can pause that. Here's another nice diagram that shows those three planes. Sagittal. If it's perfect, it's the medial plane, mid sagittal. Left portion, right portion. Transverse, perpendicular to the long axis of the person in this picture. But the new one that we don't have in domestic animals that are quadrupeds are the coronal plane or the coronal planes. They call it the frontal planes as well. Divides an animal, or in this case the human, into some anterior portion up here and some posterior portion. I'm including this just so you know that these planes are a little different for the different animals.